Agree. Agreed, Gary. Getting to thing number three, what everybody's been waiting for, some longer than others. The CPI is down. The Fed is cutting. I should know this. Arthur Burns is expecting company. Is he still alive?
I believe he's not. He
Okay.
was he was the Fed chairman before Paul Volcker. So he
Right.
was the Fed chairman back in the 1960s and I
Okay.
believe
Yeah.
the early 70s. This is 50 years
Yeah.
later.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Enough said.
I believe he's not still around.
Okay. Gary, thing number three, CPI softens, rate cuts, quote, sooner rather than later, a DKI term, means this week. Gary, let's dive into it with these rates here coming up in the next couple of days.
All right, we are filming this on Monday afternoon, the 16th.
Yep.
On Wednesday, just 2 days from now, the Federal Reserve is going to put out a press release indicating that they have cut the Fed funds rate. After that, Chairman Powell will do a press conference where I predict that he will, field 74 questions, all asking him, how much more they're going to cut and when it's going to happen and what the timing of all of this is. And then he's going to look annoyed and tell everybody we're data driven, we're going to keep cutting, but we'll do it based on the data and we'll be looking at all of this other stuff. And however much he cuts, people are going to ask why he didn't do more or less. At any rate, the last piece of data we got was the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. That index is horrendously inaccurate and intentionally so. It is not designed to measure real inflation. But it is, when people talk about inflation, that's the index that people typically talk about. So the August CPI showed an increase of 2.5% for the year and 0.3% for the month. That was below last month's 2.9% and consistent with expectations. When you take a look at this chart, that number that we're talking about is the blue line on the first chart. And you can see it has come down. There's no question that inflation has come down. The core number, which excludes food and energy, that has been consistently sticky. That was 3.2% for the last year, which was also consistent with expectations. The Fed is aiming for 2%, but they're clearly going to reduce rates before we get to 2%. And, for the people who say, well, wait a minute, why do you say the CPI is understated and intentionally so? Here's my question for you. If you're listening to this, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics tells you that the CPI or inflation is up 2.5%, I'm just going to ask you, are your expenses this year up only 2.5% versus last year? My guess is, for most of the people listening to this or watching this, your personal inflation rate is probably substantially higher. Now, there are some people, who maybe they've locked in their housing costs, they didn't need to buy a car. There are people who will be lower, but I think for most of us, we're experiencing inflation in excess of 2.5%.
Yeah, Gary, the all item CPA is down substantially. Fed Reserve has done all it can to try and bring inflation under control. You think that there's two areas of both current and future issues. Talk to us about those. The first being that current inflation isn't due to Federal Reserve policies.
So Rob, that is a huge problem. Typically it's the Fed that is held responsible for inflation and then held responsible for reducing inflation. And, when you take a look at that first chart and you see that inflation has come down, or at least the CPI has come down, people say, okay, great, good job to the Federal Reserve for doing that. The issue is that current inflation is not being caused by a too low federal funds rate. The reason why, even though the Fed now has positive real interest rates would be the Fed funds rate less the CPI. It's saying, after inflation, can you earn money in bonds? And the answer right now is yes. But right now, inflation is being caused by massive overspending in Congress. Congress is overspending by about $1 trillion every 100 days. So it'll be, $2-3 trillion this year. Interest expense annualized has gone over $1 trillion. We're now spending more on that than anything else. And what's happening is we're not paying for that out of taxes. We're paying for that through more issuance of currency, more issuance of debt. It's effectively creating more dollars and more liquidity in the economy. And the result of that is inflation. That's how we're paying for all of that spending. And one of the things we've been saying for years, people got excited to get their stimulus checks. And who's paying for the stimmies? You are. You are paying for your stimmies. And so, when we're running government programs that have a big social safety network, things like welfare and Medicare and Medicaid, and a big military, big defense budget, lots of interest expense, roads projects, infrastructure projects, everything the government spends money on. There are lots of people, who think we should be funding the millions of people who have come across the border and are in the country now. And, they're getting free to them, hotels and food and, all kinds of additional benefits. Listen, if you're for it, fine. If you're against it, fine. We're not taking a stand on that. I'm just pointing out that spending isn't free. And because we're not paying for it in taxes, we're paying for that spending in higher prices. So whatever those government programs are, you're paying for your stimmies. And Powell and the Fed, they don't have control over that. There are two other problems I'd point out, Rob. One is even if the CPI went to zero, let's just say we got rid of inflation. Right now, after years of inflation, price levels are so high that a lot of families are having difficulty making ends meet. And so even if we got inflation down to zero, if you're having difficulty making ends meet, guess what? This doesn't fix that. The other thing is, take a look at the second chart that Andrew's going to toss up here. He did a great job on that chart. And what we did was we tracked the CPI from March of 1966 through December of 1982. And we overlaid that with the CPI starting in September 2013. And, what we see is that they both had this big spike and then interest rates came down. And when that happened, back in the 1970s, then Fed Chairman Arthur Burns let off the gas too early. In fairness to him, Lyndon Johnson picked him up and slammed him against a wall. It was President Johnson at the time. And so Burns caved and he cut rates too early. And we ended up with the horrendous inflation and stagflation that came in the late 1970s. And when you look at this chart, that red line now is where we are. And that's where the Fed's going to cut. And, I understand why people want rate cuts. But a year from now, people may be regretting the rate cuts that are going to start 2 days from now. And if you look at that chart, you'll see the reason why.
We'll keep you in tune with everything happening with the cuts expected to be Thursday. Gary, I'm sure we'll have notes Wednesday, excuse me. We'll have notes on all of that and what to make of it as that happens and distributed via our premium subscriber, free subscriber list as well, I'm sure, with at least a general update there.